First Samuel is a 31-chapter history book that can be divided into three main parts. Chapters 1 through 8 cover Samuel, the last judge. Chapters 9 through 15 cover Saul, the first king. And chapters 16 through 31 cover the flight of the anointed David. The first part, chapters 1 through 8, covering Samuel, the last judge, can be further divided into two parts, with chapters 1 through 3 covering Samuel's calling and chapters 4 through 8 covering the journey of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. First, let's look at chapters 1 through 3, which cover Samuel's calling as the last of the judges. This section consists of Samuel's birth, the story of Eli the priest's rebellious sons that led to Samuel's calling, and Samuel's subsequent calling on behalf of Eli's sons. Next, we'll look at chapters 4 through 8, which covers the journey of the ark and the part of the last judge Samuel. This part tells the story of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, which was taken during the Philistine invasion, being set in the house of Dagon at Ashdod in Philistia, and then being moved to Beth Shemesh in Israel, and then to Kirjath Jearim in Israel, and then the people's demand for a king, disappointed to see Samuel's rebellious sons who would later succeed him. Note that chapter 8 is the transition from the reign of the judges to the king's reign, and is the story of the people's demand for a king. The second part, chapters 9 through 15, dealing with Saul, the first king, can again be divided into two parts. Chapters 9 through 12 cover Saul's enthronement, and chapters 13 through 15 cover Saul's crimes. First, let's look at chapters 9 through 12, which cover Saul's enthronement as the first king. This section consists of the story of Saul's being chosen as king, being anointed with oil and officially enthroned as king, and Samuel's preaching to the people about the theocratic kingdom during Saul's official enthronement. Next, we'll look at chapters 13 through 15, which deal with the crimes of Saul, the first king. In this section, Saul commits the sin of violating the high priesthood during the confrontation with the Philistines. Saul's son Jonathan's victory over the Philistines at Michmash during the war with the Philistines. Saul's subsequent victory in the war against Amalek and his disobedience of God's command to destroy Amalek, sparing the Amalekite king Agag and sparing each of his servant animals, and then being rejected by God. For reference, it's helpful to remember that Saul sins twice in this section. Once during the war against the Philistines, which is recorded in chapters 13 and 14, and again after winning the war against Amalek and disobeying God's command to destroy Amalek, which is recorded in chapter 15. Next comes the third part, which covers David's flight after being anointed king, and is recorded in chapters 16 through 31. This section can be further divided into three parts: Saul's envy from chapters 16 through 19, David's flight from chapters 20 through 26, and David's exile from chapters 27 through 31. Let's first look at chapters 16 to 19, which cover Saul's envy during David's flight after his anointing as king. This section consists of David's anointing by Samuel, his rise to popularity for killing the Philistine general Goliath, and Saul's jealousy of him, who plots to kill him, leading David to temporarily flee to Naioth in Ramah. Next, we'll look at chapters 20 through 26, which focus on David's flight during his flight after being anointed king. This section consists of David's full-blown flight, after realizing through Jonathan that Saul's intention to kill him was certain. From Nob and Gath of Philistine, to Adullam in Israel, to Mizpeh in Moab, to the forest of Hereth in Israel, to Keilah, to the wilderness of Ziph, to the wilderness of Maon, to the cave of Engedi, where he spared Saul's life, and then to the wilderness of Paran, then to Carmel, then to the hill of Hachilah, where he spared Saul's life again. Next, we'll look at chapters 27 through 31, which cover David's exile during his flight after being anointed king. David was unable to trust Saul despite Saul's remorse. He exiles to Gath and the Philistines and resides in Ziklag for several years. Later, when the Philistines invade Israel, David attempts to join them as a warrior, but is rejected by the Philistine princes and returns to Ziklag. While David is away, the Amalekite invades Ziklag, and David pursues and defeats the Amalekite. Later, Saul, during his battle with the Philistines, where he eventually falls to his death at Gilboa. For reference, let's briefly review David's flight route and the events that occurred during his flight, which are covered in chapters 20 through 31. David begins his flight from Jebus, an old name for Jerusalem, and flees to Nob, where he is supplied with altar bread by the priest Ahimelech, and acquires Goliath's sword. David then flees to Gath in the Philistines, where he feigns insanity in front of Achish in an attempt to read Achish's mind. When Achish refuses to accept him, David flees again and takes refuge in the cave of Adullam in Judah, where he is united with his parents, brothers, and 400 followers. David then flees to Mizpeh in Moab, where he leaves his parents in charge of the king, and then goes to the forest of Hereth in Judah at the word of the prophet Gad. Saul learns, through a snitch from Doeg, that Ahimelech, a priest of Nob, has entertained David, and he slaughters the priests of Nob. Abiathar, Ahimelech's son, narrowly escapes to David. Later, David saves Keilah from the Philistines' attack on the city, and flees Saul's pursuit into the wilderness of Ziph, where he meets Jonathan. Again, David flees to the wilderness of Maon, at the snitch of the Ziphites, and then to the Philistine invasion of Israel, where Saul temporarily gives up pursuing him. David flees from the wilderness of Maon to the cave of En-Gedi, where he spares the life of Saul, who is pursuing him from the Philistines, causing Saul to regret his actions and withdraw. After Samuel's death, David flees to the wilderness of Paran, and later to Carmel, where he resides for a time. He asks for food from the wealthy Nabal, but when Nabal refuses, David plots the annihilation of Nabal's house. However, the wisdom of Abigail, Nabal's wife, leads him to abandon his plan to exterminate the house of Nabal, and David later marries Abigail after Nabal, who is afraid of him, eventually dies. David then flees to the hill of Hachilah, where he spares Saul, who is pursuing him a second time, causing Saul to regret his actions and withdraw. However, David fears that he will one day be captured by Saul, so he flees to Gath in the Philistines, and is granted permission by the Philistine king Achish to live in Ziklag. David then wins Achish's favor by defeating the Geshurites, the Gezrites, and the Amalekites, while pretending to have defeated the people of Judah. As the Philistines prepare to go to war against Israel, Achish asks David to join him. However, the Philistine princes distrust David, so he is denied and returns to Ziklag. While David and his men are away, Ziklag is invaded by the Amalekites, and many people, including David's family, are taken captive. But David, arriving later, pursues the Amalekites, defeats them, rescues his captured family and people, and remains in Ziklag until Saul is killed in battle with the Philistines, which ends David's exile.